Picture this, a wooden deck slick with seawater and something darker. The morning sun has barely crested the Sicilian hills, but already the air tastes of copper and salt. A man kneels in the wreckage of what was once a ship's prow, his hands pressed against splintered planks that were whole just moments ago. Around him, the Mediterranean has changed colour. It is no longer blue, it is the colour of wine left too long in the sun, the colour of iron, the colour of ending. The screaming hasn't stopped. It comes from everywhere, from the water where men thrash in armour too heavy to swim in, from burning hulls that drift like funeral pyres, from the tangled mass of ships locked together in an embrace that kills everyone it touches. The smoke rises in columns so thick they blot out the coastline. Somewhere beneath the chaos, a galley groans and splits apart, spilling 200 men into water they will never surface from. The kneeling man cannot hear his own breathing. His ears ring from the collision, the sound of a bronze ram punching through cedar at ramming speed, a sound like the world cracking open. His hands are bleeding. He doesn't remember when that happened. He doesn't remember anything except the moment before impact, when he looked across the narrowing gap between his ship and the enemy vessel and saw a Carthaginian marine staring back at him with the same expression he must be wearing now. Terror. Pure, holy terror. The marine is dead now. His body floats face down 30 feet away, bumping against the oars of a ship that no longer has anyone alive to row it. The kneeling man watches the corpse drift. He should feel something. Victory, perhaps. Relief. Instead, he feels nothing but the cold certainty that this morning has broken something in him that will never heal. This is the Battle of Ecnomus, the largest naval engagement the ancient world will ever witness. 680 warships, 300,000 men, a stretch of sea so choked with wreckage that survivors will later claim they could walk from deck to deck without touching water. And the kneeling man, the one with bleeding hands and ringing ears and a face that has forgotten how to show emotion, is a Roman consul named Marcus Atilius Regulus. He is 38 years old. He has never commanded a naval battle before. None of his countrymen have. Rome, the city he serves, did not possess a single warship 12 years ago. They were farmers, soldiers, builders of roads and walls. The sea was something other people understood, something dangerous, something that belonged to Carthage. Carthage. The name alone once made Roman senators change the subject. The greatest maritime empire the Mediterranean had ever known. Masters of trade routes stretching from Spain to Syria. Builders of harbours that made Rome's look like fishing villages. Commanders of fleets that had ruled these waters for 300 years, while Rome was still fighting over hills and sheep pastures. And now Carthage is burning. Regulus rises to his feet. His legs shake. His vision swims. But he forces himself to look, really look, at what surrounds him. Carthaginian warships, the finest vessels money and expertise could build, are sinking in clusters. Their famous kinkerames, each one crewed by 300 trained sailors, are being dragged down by boarding bridges they never saw coming. Their marines, the professional killers who had terrified generations of coastal peoples, are dying at the hands of Roman legionaries who learned to fight at sea by simply refusing to fight at sea at all. They turned the ocean into land. They made the water into a battlefield their enemies couldn't recognize. Historians still debate whether Regulus understood in that moment just how completely the world had changed. Whether he grasped that this single morning would end Carthaginian naval dominance forever. Whether he knew that the secret weapon now slamming his ships into enemy hulls, a simple boarding bridge called the corvus, would rewrite every rule of Mediterranean warfare. But standing on that blood-slick deck, watching the empire of Carthage drown around him, Marcus Atilius Regulus must have felt something else entirely. Something that would eventually destroy him far more thoroughly than any Carthaginian sword. He felt like a god. And that feeling, that intoxicating certainty that Rome could do anything, beat anyone, bend the world to its will, would carry him all the way to Africa, all the way to triumph, all the way to a prison cell in Carthage where he would die in chains, learning too late the lesson that Ecnomus should have taught him. The sea gives nothing for free. How does a farmer's republic defeat the greatest naval power in history and lose everything in the winning? The decision that led to Ecnomus was made in a building that smelled of sweat and barely contained rage. The Roman Senate chamber in 264 BC was not the marble monument later generations would construct. It was a cramped hall where men who owned farms argued with men who owned armies, where alliances shifted between morning and evening sessions, where the fate of nations was decided by whoever shouted longest. On this particular day, the shouting concerned a question that had seemed absurd just 10 years earlier. Should Rome go to war with Carthage? The senators who opposed the motion had logic on their side. Rome was a land power. Its legions had conquered the Italian peninsula through discipline, engineering, and an almost religious devotion to infantry tactics. They had beaten the Samnites, crushed the Etruscans, humiliated the Greek colonies of the south. On solid ground, with shields locked and gladi drawn, Roman soldiers were the most effective killing force the Western Mediterranean had ever produced. But the sea was different. The sea belonged to Carthage. Carthaginian admirals had been perfecting naval warfare since before Rome was a village of mud huts on the Tiber. Their shipyards in North Africa could produce quinquerie, massive warships rowed by 300 men, faster than most nations could build fishing boats. Their sailors were professionals, trained from childhood in the currents and winds of a sea they considered their private lake. Their marines were mercenaries drawn from across the Mediterranean, men who killed for money and had been killing longer than most Roman soldiers had been alive. The senators who favoured war had something else, ambition that bordered on insanity. Sicily was the prize. The island sat at the centre of Mediterranean trade routes like a jewel in a crown, and both Rome and Carthage had been circling it for generations. When a group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines asked Rome for help against Carthaginian expansion, the war faction saw their opportunity. Forget that Rome had no fleet. Forget that Carthage had never lost a naval war. Forget that the entire enterprise was, by any rational calculation, suicide. Rome wanted Sicily. Rome would have Sicily. The sea was merely an inconvenience. Historians still debate whether the senators understood what they were unleashing. The First Punic War would last 23 years. It would kill hundreds of thousands of men. It would nearly bankrupt both empires and fundamentally reshape the political geography of the ancient world. But in 264 BC, in that sweat-soaked chamber, the men who voted for war saw only glory. The first years confirmed every fear the opposition had voiced. Rome scraped together a makeshift fleet, mostly allied vessels from Greek cities that owed them favours, and sent it against Carthaginian naval forces near Sicily. The results were predictable. Roman commanders, trained to think in terms of cavalry charges and infantry formations, had no framework for understanding combat on water. Their ships were slower, their crews untrained, their tactics laughable. The Carthaginians didn't merely defeat them, they humiliated them. Roman vessels were rammed and sunk while their commanders were still trying to figure out which direction the wind was blowing. The Senate received report after report of disaster. Ships lost, men drowned, commanders captured and ransomed back at prices that made treasurers weep. The Greek allies began making excuses for why their vessels weren't available. The army, which had been winning consistent victories on land, watched the navy fail and began to question whether the war was winnable at all. In Carthage, the mood was celebration. The Romans had done exactly what everyone expected. They had tried to fight the sea, and the sea had won. Carthaginian merchants raised prices on goods bound for Italy. Carthaginian admirals competed for the honour of commanding the fleets that would finish Rome's pretensions once and for all. The war, they believed, was already over. Rome simply hadn't admitted it yet. They were wrong. They were catastrophically, historically, fatally wrong. Because in a Roman shipyard, in a city that had never built a warship, engineers were examining a captured Carthaginian quinquereme with expressions that mixed confusion with something far more dangerous: curiosity. The vessel had washed ashore during a storm, intact, abandoned, a gift from the gods or from Carthaginian carelessness. Roman craftsmen walked its length, measuring, calculating, arguing about construction techniques none of them had ever used. The ship was alien to them. Every plank, every joint, every carefully carved oar spoke of expertise Rome did not possess. They built one anyway, then they built 100 more. The decision made no sense. It violated every principle of gradual military development. You cannot create a navy from nothing. You cannot train sailors in weeks who should be trained over years. You cannot build ships without shipwrights, command fleets without admirals, win battles without experience. But Rome was not interested in what was possible. Rome was interested in what was necessary. And so, in shipyards up and down the Italian coast, the impossible began to take shape. The smell was the first thing the workers noticed. Fresh-cut timber has a clean scent, pine and cedar and oak releasing their essences as saws bite through. But the Roman shipyards in 260 BC smelled of something else beneath the sawdust. Sweat. Human waste. The particular stench of men worked past the point of exhaustion into something that resembled slow death. The Senate had ordered a fleet of 120 warships in 60 days. The Senate did not care how it was accomplished. The Senate cared only that when those 60 days ended, Roman hulls would be floating in Roman harbours, ready to die for Roman ambitions. So the engineers did the only thing they could. They built the fleet on the backs of slaves who would not survive to see it sail. The captured Carthaginian quinquereme was disassembled plank by plank. Every piece was numbered, measured, sketched on wax tablets by engineers who had never built anything larger than a transport barge. The ship's design was elegant, a masterpiece of Carthaginian naval architecture, but elegance meant nothing to men racing against the calendar. They needed copies. They needed them fast. They needed them to float. The construction process that followed was less shipbuilding than organised madness. Timber was cut from forests that had never been logged for naval purposes, hauled to the coast by ox teams that dropped dead in their traces, shaped by carpenters who learned the craft through failure. For every plank that fit properly, 3 were discarded. For every joint that held under stress, 5 had to be recut. The waste was staggering. The Senate sent more timber. The Senate sent more slaves. Historians still debate whether the Roman commanders understood the human cost of their timetable. The sources mention numbers: 10,000 workers, 15,000, 20,000. But numbers flatten suffering into abstraction. They don't capture the sound of a man collapsing from heat exhaustion while his overseer's whip was still in mid-swing. They don't describe the taste of sawdust mixed with blood from split lips. They don't explain how workers learned to sleep standing up because lying down meant never rising again. The shipyards became factories of death that happened to produce warships as a byproduct. And somehow, impossibly, the ships appeared. They were ugly by Carthaginian standards, rough-hewn, poorly balanced, finished with the desperate speed of men who knew failure meant execution. But they floated. They moved under oar power. They could carry marines and ram enemy vessels. They were not masterpieces, they were weapons. The Senate had solved the first problem. Rome now possessed ships. The second problem was even more daunting. Rome possessed no one who knew how to use them. Naval warfare in the ancient Mediterranean was a skilled profession. Carthaginian oarsmen trained for years to develop the coordination that allowed 300 men to move a quinquereme through combat maneuvers. Their helmsmen knew every current and wind pattern in waters their grandfathers had sailed. Their captains could read a battle's flow the way legionary commanders read terrain. This expertise wasn't something you could requisition or conscript. It accumulated over generations. Rome had 60 days. The solution was as brutal as the shipbuilding. Roman commanders constructed wooden frames on land, scaffolding shaped like ship benches, and drilled thousands of men in synchronized rowing without ever putting them near water. Day after day, week after week, men who had never seen the sea sat on wooden planks and pulled at oars that moved nothing but air, learning the rhythms of naval movement through blisters and muscle memory. The training was brutal. Men who couldn't keep time were beaten. Men who collapsed from exhaustion were replaced. The Roman military machine, designed for infantry warfare, turned its organizational genius toward creating sailors the same way it created soldiers, through systematic dehumanization. When the 60 days ended, Rome had a fleet. Not a good fleet. Not an experienced fleet. But a fleet. The Carthaginians received reports of Roman activity and dismissed them. Their spies described the shoddy construction, the untrained crews, the commanders who still confused port and starboard. Professional naval officers laughed at the descriptions. Rome was building toys and calling them warships. Rome was training farmers and calling them sailors. The first real engagement would expose the farce. The first real engagement did expose something, but not what Carthage expected. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, the new Roman fleet met a Carthaginian squadron commanded by officers who had been winning naval battles since before most Roman captains had seen the sea. The Carthaginians approached with the confidence of professionals facing amateurs. Their formation was perfect, their crews were synchronized, their bronze rams gleamed in the Mediterranean sun. Then the Roman ships deployed something no one had ever seen before. A boarding bridge, a wooden gangplank with an iron spike at the end. A device so simple it seemed like a joke. It wasn't a joke, it was the end of an era. The corvus had arrived. The device measured 36 feet long and 4 feet wide, and that's all. A plank with a heavy iron spike at one end and a rope and pulley system at the other. No moving parts, no complex mechanisms, nothing that a competent carpenter couldn't build in an afternoon with scraps from a construction site. And yet this plank, this corvus, this raven, would break Carthaginian naval power more completely than any weapon the ancient world had ever produced. The design was born from desperation that had curdled into genius. Roman engineers, faced with the impossible task of defeating experienced Carthaginian crews in ship-to-ship manoeuvring, had asked a question that professionals considered absurd. What if we don't fight their kind of battle? Traditional naval combat in 260 BC was a dance of rams and oars. Ships circled each other like predators, looking for angles of attack. The goal was to strike an enemy vessel amidships with a bronze ram, a crushing blow that shattered hulls and drowned crews in minutes. Winning required superior speed, superior handling, superior coordination. Carthage had all three. Rome had none. But Rome had legionaries. Rome had men trained since adolescence to fight in close quarters, shield pressed against shield, gladius punching into vulnerable flesh. On land, these men were the most efficient killers in the Western Mediterranean. The corvus put them back on land, even in the middle of the sea. The mechanism was brutally simple. As a Roman ship approached an enemy vessel, the corvus was raised vertically against the mast, held by ropes like a siege tower waiting to fall. When the ships came within range, perhaps 30 feet, perhaps less, the ropes were released. The heavy boarding bridge crashed down onto the enemy deck. The iron spike at its end punched through wood, locking the two ships together, and then the legionaries charged. Historians still debate whether the Carthaginians at Mylae understood what was happening before it was too late. One moment they were executing standard anti-ramming maneuvers, confident in their superiority. The next, wooden bridges were slamming onto their decks and armoured men were pouring across like ants from a disturbed nest. The sound must have been apocalyptic. Bronze rams had already collided when the corvus dropped. That was part of the Roman strategy, using the impact to stabilise both vessels. But the crash of the boarding bridge added something new, the thunder of iron biting wood, followed by the rhythmic pounding of hobnailed sandals on planking. Then the screaming started. Carthaginian marines were professionals, but they were naval professionals. They fought with javelins and short swords, trained for the quick skirmishes that happened when ships brushed past each other. They were not prepared for legionary tactics. The locked shields, the systematic advance, the coordinated stabbing that turned combat into butchery. The Romans didn't fight like sailors. They fought like they were storming a fortification. And in a sense, they were. Every Carthaginian ship became a fortress to be taken, its deck a piece of land to be conquered. The sea beneath them was irrelevant. The naval tactics Carthage had spent generations perfecting were irrelevant. All that mattered was what happened on the wood. The slaughter at Mylae was comprehensive. Carthage lost 50 ships, 14 rammed, 31 captured by boarding. Their admiral barely escaped with his life. Their reputation as masters of the sea died somewhere in the water between those burning hulls, drowned alongside the professional sailors who had believed that expertise would always defeat innovation. Rome had discovered something transformational. You didn't need to beat your enemy at their own game. You needed to change the game entirely. The Senate received news of the victory with an enthusiasm that bordered on religious ecstasy. They ordered more corvus bridges. They authorized more ships. They began planning operations that would have seemed delusional 6 months earlier. If Rome could beat Carthage at sea, if farmers could slaughter sailors, then what couldn't Rome accomplish? The answer, of course, was plenty. The corvus was not a perfect weapon. The boarding bridge made ships top-heavy and unstable in rough weather. Storms would eventually claim more Roman vessels than Carthaginian rams. The device worked best in calm waters against enemies who hadn't adapted to it. Given time, Carthage would learn to keep distance, to avoid the killing range. But Rome didn't give them time. Within 3 years of Mylae, Roman commanders were planning something that made the original invasion of Sicily look cautious. They would build the largest fleet ever assembled in the ancient world. They would cross the open sea to North Africa itself. They would carry the war to Carthage's doorstep and end it forever. The corvus had given Rome confidence. Confidence was about to become arrogance, and arrogance at sea always demands payment. The two men who would command Rome's invasion of Africa had almost nothing in common except ambition and the consulship. Marcus Atilius Regulus came from a family of farmers who had climbed into the senatorial class through military service and relentless competence. His face was weathered from campaigns in southern Italy, his hands calloused from years of gripping sword hilts and reins. He spoke rarely in Senate debates, but when he spoke, men listened, not because his words were eloquent, but because they were usually followed by actions that made the words irrelevant. Lucius Manlius Vulso was a different creature entirely. His family had been noble for generations, their wealth measured in estates and client networks rather than military victories. Where Regulus was taciturn, Vulso was expansive. Where Regulus planned, Vulso improvised. They had served together in previous campaigns and developed a working relationship built on mutual wariness rather than friendship. The Senate, in its wisdom, gave them joint command of the African expedition. Joint command was a Roman tradition that served political purposes more than military ones. It ensured that no single family gained too much glory, no single general accumulated too much power. It also meant that every strategic decision required negotiation between men who might disagree on everything from timing to tactics. For the African invasion, this arrangement was either genius or madness, probably both. The plan they developed was staggering in its scope. Rome would assemble a fleet of 330 warships, more naval power than the Mediterranean had ever seen concentrated in one place. Each ship would carry a full complement of marines, legionaries adapted for naval combat, equipped with the corvus bridges that had shattered Carthaginian supremacy at Mylae. The fleet would also transport cavalry, siege equipment, and supplies for an extended land campaign. The target was Africa itself, not Sicily, not the disputed islands, not the peripheral territories where both powers had been bleeding each other for years. Rome would sail directly to Carthage's homeland and end the war at its source. Historians still debate whether Regulus and Vulso believed their own propaganda. The strategic logic was seductive. Carthage drew its wealth from African trade networks, its manpower from African subjects, its confidence from the assumption that no enemy could threaten its home territory. A successful invasion would collapse all three pillars simultaneously. The war would end not through attrition but through decapitation. The problems with this logic were numerous and potentially fatal. First, Rome had never conducted a major amphibious invasion. Moving 300 ships across open water, coordinating their arrival, establishing a beachhead on hostile shores. These were challenges that defeated experienced naval powers, let alone farmers who had learned sailing from a captured enemy vessel. Second, Carthage still possessed a formidable fleet. The defeats at Mylae and subsequent engagements had been shocking, but Carthaginian shipyards could replace losses faster than Rome could build new vessels. The journey to Africa would take Roman ships through waters Carthage had dominated for centuries. Interception was not merely possible, it was probable. Third, and most critically, there was no extraction plan. If the invasion failed, if the army was defeated, if the fleet was destroyed, if supplies ran short, the survivors would be stranded on a hostile continent with no route home. The Senate had authorized the expedition but had not provided for its failure. In Roman strategic thinking, failure was not an option to be planned for. Failure was what happened to other people. The consuls accepted these risks because the alternative was worse. The war in Sicily had become a grinding stalemate, consuming resources and manpower at rates that threatened Rome's long-term viability. Every year the conflict continued, Carthage had time to adapt to the corvus, to develop counter-tactics, to rebuild its confidence. The invasion wasn't just an opportunity, it was a necessity. Before we see how this ends, understand one thing. The men boarding those ships at the port of Ecnomus weren't volunteers for glory. They were conscripts for a gamble. Farmers pulled from fields they might never see again. Fathers leaving families that might never learn their fates. Young men who had trained on landlocked rowing frames being told they would cross the open sea and assault a continent. The ships themselves groaned under impossible loads. Quinqueremes designed for speed and maneuverability were packed with soldiers, horses, supplies, siege equipment. Their waterlines rode dangerously low. Their corvus bridges added top-heavy instability to vessels already struggling with excess weight. Every naval professional who saw them must have calculated the disaster potential. But there were no naval professionals in the Roman command structure. There were only 2 consuls who had never lost a battle and saw no reason why the sea should be different from the land. In the summer of 256 BC, the largest fleet in ancient history set sail for Africa. Carthage was waiting for them. The messenger reached Carthage at sunset, his horse foam-flecked and staggering. 300 Roman ships, heading south, invasion strength. The council chamber erupted into chaos that smelled of expensive perfume and barely concealed terror. Carthaginian nobles, men who had built fortunes on the assumption that no enemy could threaten their homeland, shouted questions that no one could answer. How had Rome assembled such a fleet without Carthaginian spies detecting it? Where were the patrol squadrons that should have provided warning? Who was responsible for this catastrophic intelligence failure? The answers, had anyone been calm enough to hear them, were uncomfortable. Carthage had grown complacent. The defeats at Mylae and subsequent battles had been explained away as flukes, as the result of the corvus surprise, as temporary setbacks that would be corrected once proper counter-tactics were developed. The aristocratic families who controlled Carthaginian war policy had been more concerned with protecting their commercial interests than with monitoring Roman shipyards. Now 300 warships were sailing toward Africa, and Carthage's response was still tangled in committee debates. The fleet that eventually assembled to intercept the Romans was impressive on paper. 350 ships crewed by professionals, commanded by admirals who had spent their lives on these waters. But paper concealed problems that would prove decisive. The ships had been gathered hastily from multiple squadrons, their crews unfamiliar with each other's signals and tactics. The commanders disagreed about strategy, some favouring immediate engagement, others arguing for a defensive position near the African coast. Historians still debate whether Hamilcar and Hanno, the admirals chosen to lead the Carthaginian response, understood how badly the strategic situation had deteriorated. They knew the corvus had changed naval combat. They had developed theoretical responses, maintained distance, avoid boarding range, used superior seamanship to circle and ram without exposure to the iron bridges. These tactics made sense in planning sessions. The problem was that Roman ships didn't follow theoretical expectations. The Carthaginian fleet took up position near Ecnomus, a coastal town on Sicily's southern shore, where geography would force the Roman fleet to pass. The location was well chosen. The coastline created a natural funnel that would prevent the Romans from spreading their formation too wide. Carthaginian ships would have room to maneuver, while Roman vessels would be constrained. The plan was elegant. Divide the Roman fleet, isolate portions of it. Destroy them in detail while preventing the corvus from being deployed effectively. Classical naval tactics applied to a new enemy. It should have worked. What Hamilcar and Hanno didn't fully grasp was that Roman commanders had stopped thinking about naval warfare entirely. Regulus and Vulso had organised their 300 ships into a formation that made Carthaginian officers laugh when scouts reported it. The Romans had arranged their fleet in a triangle, 2 squadrons forming the leading edges, a third towing the horse transports, a fourth guarding the rear. It looked like an infantry formation someone had accidentally dropped onto water. That's exactly what it was, and that's why it would work. The Roman formation wasn't designed for naval combat. It was designed to protect the core of the fleet, the transport ships carrying cavalry and supplies, while the warships on the edges engaged and pinned any attackers. The consuls had essentially created a moving fortress, sacrificing maneuverability for cohesion. Carthaginian doctrine said this was stupid. Naval engagements were fluid, dynamic, built on speed and positioning. A formation this rigid would be shattered by concentrated attacks on its corners, broken apart and destroyed piecemeal. Except the Romans weren't planning to maneuver. They were planning to absorb whatever Carthage threw at them and keep moving forward. They were planning to turn a naval battle into a siege, with their own fleet as the castle. And here's where it gets worse. The Carthaginian admirals, executing their sophisticated tactical plan, would split their own fleet to encircle the Roman formation. They would succeed in surrounding the enemy. They would achieve the positional advantage that naval doctrine said should win battles, and then they would discover that surrounding a Roman fleet meant that every single ship in their encirclement was within corvus range. The trap would work. It would catch the Romans exactly as planned. It would also give the Romans exactly what they wanted. close combat across the entire battlefield, with nowhere for Carthaginian seamanship to provide escape. The sun rose on the morning of the battle, burning away the coastal fog to reveal two fleets arranged for mutual destruction. 300 Roman ships against 350 Carthaginian, 680 vessels carrying nearly 300,000 men. The largest naval battle in ancient history was about to begin, and Carthage, for all its experience, for all its professional sailors and tactical sophistication, had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. The Carthaginian centre retreated, and the Romans took the bait. It was the oldest naval manoeuvre in Mediterranean warfare. Feign weakness, draw the enemy forward, then collapse the wings onto their exposed flanks. Hamilcar's ships pulled back in apparent disorder, their oars churning foam as they opened distance from the Roman formation. The consuls saw what they expected to see: Carthaginian cowardice, the same fear that had handed Rome victory at Mylae. They ordered pursuit. The Roman triangle began to stretch. The first two squadrons, personally commanded by Regulus and Vulso, surged forward after the retreating centre. Behind them, the third squadron, towing the horse transports, struggled to maintain pace. The fourth squadron, guarding the rear, fell further and further behind as the formation elongated like a piece of heated metal being drawn into wire. Hamilcar watched from his flagship and smiled. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The Carthaginian wings had been waiting for exactly this moment. On the left, Hanno's squadron exploded from its holding position, oars driving ships forward in perfect synchronization. On the right, the coastal squadron swept around the Roman formation like a door slamming shut. The Romans had obligingly separated themselves into three isolated groups, each too far from the others to provide support. Historians still debate whether the Roman consuls recognized the trap before it closed. The tactical situation had deteriorated catastrophically in the span of minutes. Regulus and Vulso's squadrons were now engaged with Hamilcar's centre, ships that had stopped retreating and turned to fight. The transport squadron was under assault from Hanno's wing, its vessels weighed down by horses and supplies, unable to manoeuvre. The rear squadron was being driven toward the coast by Carthaginian ships that knew these waters intimately. The battle had fragmented into three separate engagements, and Carthage held the advantage in each one. The sound of that first collision reached the coast. Bronze rams struck wooden hulls with impacts that spectators on shore could feel in their chests. Oars shattered as ships ground together, sending wooden shrapnel flying like arrows. Men screamed, the high, continuous screaming of sailors caught between colliding vessels, their bodies crushed by forces no armour could withstand. The sea around the Roman transport squadron turned crimson. Carthaginian ships had targeted the horse barges with particular fury, recognizing that destroying Rome's cavalry would cripple any land campaign. Horses shrieked as their vessels were holed, their hooves scrambling on tilting decks before they slid into water they couldn't swim in. Men who tried to cut the animals free were trampled. Men who didn't try were pulled down with the sinking ships. This was the moment Carthage had been waiting for. 3 years of humiliation, 3 years of watching farmers defeat professionals, 3 years of the cursed corvus turning naval skill into irrelevancy. And now the Romans were scattered, outnumbered in each engagement, finally fighting the kind of battle Carthaginian admirals had trained their entire lives to win. And then the Roman first squadron stopped pursuing. It happened so quickly that Carthaginian observers didn't immediately understand what they were seeing. Regulus and Vulso's ships, which had been chasing Hamilcar's retreating centre, suddenly broke off the engagement. Their oars reversed, their formations tightened. They began rowing, not forward into the centre, but backward toward the transport squadron under assault from Hanno. The consuls had done something that violated every principle of ancient naval combat. They had voluntarily abandoned a winning position to rescue allies in a losing one. In infantry terms, this was basic Roman doctrine. Legions supported each other. Units that broke formation to pursue were punished, while units that maintained cohesion were rewarded. The Roman army had spent centuries learning that battles were won through coordination, not individual heroism. The Roman navy had just applied the same lesson to the sea. Hanno's squadron, which had been systematically destroying the transport ships, suddenly found itself facing not only its original victims, but also the first squadron's fresh vessels. The hunters had become the hunted. Carthaginian ships that had closed to ramming range, confident in their advantage, discovered that corvus bridges were crashing onto their decks from an unexpected direction. The screaming changed character. It was no longer the sound of Romans dying. It was the sound of Carthaginian marines being swarmed by legionaries who fought with the systematic brutality of men retaking a captured fortress. Hamilcar, still engaged with what remained of the pursuing Roman ships, watched his carefully constructed trap collapse in real time. The centre couldn't disengage to support the wings. Roman vessels had locked onto them with corvus bridges, turning every ship into a connected battlefield. The left wing was being slaughtered. The coastal squadron was still driving the Roman rear toward shore, but that success suddenly looked less like a victory and more like an irrelevant sideshow. The battle that was supposed to prove Carthaginian superiority was becoming a massacre, and the killing had barely begun. The collision was like nothing the Mediterranean had ever witnessed. 200 ships locked together in a mass of splintered oars and tangled rigging, their hulls grinding with sounds that carried across miles of open water. Men fell between vessels and were crushed before they could scream. Men climbed onto enemy decks and died before their feet found purchase. Men threw javelins at targets 10 feet away and watched their weapons disappear into smoke from burning ships that no one had time to extinguish. The sea had become a flaw, a killing flaw. Hamilcar's centre was fighting for survival. The Carthaginian ships that had executed the false retreat were now locked in place by Roman boarding bridges, their superior seamanship rendered meaningless by the iron spikes that pinned them to their enemies. Sailors who had spent years learning to maneuver quinqueremes through combat now found themselves fighting as infantry on decks slick with blood and seawater. They were dying, not because they lacked skill, not because they lacked courage, but because the rules had changed and no one had told them. The Roman legionaries who poured across the corvus bridges fought with a rhythm that Carthaginian marines couldn't match. Shield, sword, step. Shield, sword, step. The movements were mechanical, drilled into muscle memory through years of training that had nothing to do with ships or sailing. These men had learned to kill in the dust of Italian training grounds, practicing against straw targets until their gladii knew exactly where to find the gaps in enemy defences. Carthaginian armour wasn't designed for this. Their shields were smaller, optimised for the fluid skirmishing of the naval combat. Their swords were longer, better for the quick cuts and retreats of fighting on moving decks. Against legionary tactics, the wall of shields, the coordinated advance, the stabbing swords that punched through defences like needles through cloth, they had no answer. The deck of a Carthaginian flagship became a charnel house, bodies stacked 2 and 3 deep as Roman soldiers advanced inch by inch, stepping over corpses that had been living men moments before. The smell was overwhelming. Copper blood, voided bowels, the acrid smoke of ships that were beginning to burn from upset cooking fires and scattered oil lamps. Historians still debate whether Hamilcar tried to disengage his squadron or whether he recognised that disengagement was already impossible. The corvus bridges that connected Roman and Carthaginian vessels had created a floating city of death, its streets made of wooden planking, its districts defined by which flag flew over which mast. Ships that tried to pull away found themselves tethered by iron spikes driven deep into their decks. Ships that tried to ram found themselves striking friendly vessels tangled in the same mass. The battle had consumed its own tactical framework. There were no longer squadrons or formations. There was only the grinding, endless close combat that Rome had wanted from the beginning. Meanwhile, Hanno's squadron was dying. The left wing that had attacked the transport ships with such confidence was now fighting on 3 fronts. The transport vessels themselves, manned by sailors who had been expecting supply duty, not combat, were resisting with desperate fury. The first squadron that had broken off pursuit was systematically boarding Carthaginian ships from their undefended sterns, and the transport escorts, freed from defensive positions by their allies' arrival, had begun their own counterattack. The slaughter defied the vocabulary of ancient naval warfare. Romans didn't capture Carthaginian ships, they cleared them. Every vessel that fell under corvus assault was swept deck by deck, compartment by compartment, until no defender remained alive to offer surrender. The professional sailors and marines who had made Carthage master of the Mediterranean for 3 centuries were butchered by farmers who had learned their craft on practice frames that never touched water. Hanno himself barely escaped. His flagship was boarded twice, the second assault reaching the steering platform before his bodyguards managed to push the Romans back. The ship that carried him to safety was missing half its oars and riding so low in the water that waves lapped over the rowing benches. Behind him, 50 Carthaginian vessels were burning or sinking. The coastal squadron, still driving the Roman rear towards shore, had achieved its objective, but the victory was hollow. Their enemies were trapped against the coastline, yes, but the coastline was friendly. Roman ships that couldn't escape could beach themselves, their crews fighting as infantry on solid ground while Carthaginian sailors struggled to land troops through the surf. The sun that had risen on 680 ships now illuminated a graveyard. Burning hulls dotted the water like torches. Corpses floated in clusters, bumping against debris with sounds that survivors would hear in their dreams for years. The screaming had finally stopped. Not because the killing had ended, but because there was no one left to scream. Rome had won. It didn't feel like winning. The battle is over. The real tragedy is just beginning. The counting started at noon, when the smoke had cleared enough to see what remained of both fleets. Roman scribes moved through the wreckage in small boats, tallying losses with the same methodical precision their counterparts used to inventory grain shipments. The numbers they recorded would become famous, the stark arithmetic of what it cost to break Carthaginian power. Rome had lost 24 ships, 24 vessels sunk or burned beyond salvage, their crews drowned or killed in the fighting. Perhaps 10,000 men. The exact number was impossible to determine when so many bodies had simply disappeared into the Mediterranean. Carthage had lost everything. 30 ships sunk, 64 more captured intact, their crews dead or fled, their contents now Roman property. More than 40,000 men killed, drowned, or taken prisoner. Admirals Hamilcar and Hanno had escaped with perhaps 100 vessels, scattered remnants of a fleet that had sailed into battle believing itself invincible. The prisoners were the worst part. Carthaginian sailors and marines, dragged from the water or pulled from captured ships, were herded onto Roman decks with the efficiency of livestock management. Some were wounded, clutching at injuries that would kill them within hours. Some were uninjured but broken, their eyes showing the particular emptiness of men who had watched their world collapse. Some were defiant, spitting at their captors, earning beatings that their pride could no longer prevent. Historians still debate whether Regulus felt triumph or something else when he walked among the captured. The sources describe him moving through the wreckage with an expression that witnesses struggled to interpret. He had done the impossible. He had broken Carthage's navy. He had cleared the path to Africa. And standing on a deck piled with Carthaginian dead, he must have wondered, what else could he break? The fleet regrouped over the following days. Damaged ships were repaired or cannibalized for parts. Wounded men were treated or left to die, depending on the severity of their injuries and the availability of surgeons. The captured Carthaginian vessels, sleek quinquereas designed by the finest naval architects in the Mediterranean, were integrated into the Roman fleet, their foreign lines now flying Roman standards. The consuls held a council of war that lasted 3 hours. The strategic situation had transformed completely. Carthage's main fleet was scattered and demoralized. The sea lanes to Africa lay open. The army and cavalry, somehow preserved through the chaos of battle, were ready for the invasion they had been promised. But the council also discussed problems that the victory had created. The fleet was now larger but harder to manage. Captured ships required crews, and Roman sailors were already stretched thin. The journey to Africa would take days, and Carthaginian squadrons might regroup to attack during the crossing. Supplies were adequate for the invasion's opening phase, but no one had planned for a prolonged campaign. Most critically, there was still no extraction plan. If the invasion failed, 300 ships and 100,000 men would be stranded on hostile shores with no route home. The victory at Ecnomus had eliminated the naval threat, but it hadn't changed the fundamental strategic insanity of the African campaign. Regulus dismissed these concerns with the confidence of a man who had just achieved the impossible. Carthage was broken, Africa would fall, Rome would dictate peace terms from the ruins of the enemy capital. The senators who had warned of overreach would be proven wrong, just as they had been proven wrong about every other stage of this war. The fleet sailed for Africa 3 days after the battle. The crossing was uneventful. Carthaginian survivors were too scattered to mount an organised response, and the weather cooperated with Roman ambitions. The African coast appeared on the horizon like a promise, its beaches white and empty, its interior rich with the wealth that Rome intended to claim. They had won. It didn't feel like winning. Something had changed in the men who had fought at Ecnomus. The veterans who had survived the boarding actions moved differently than before. more carefully, more quietly, as if sound itself might attract the violence they had witnessed. The officers who had commanded ships now had difficulty maintaining eye contact with their subordinates, aware that the orders they had given had sent men to deaths more horrible than anything land warfare could produce. And Regulus, the architect of victory, had begun showing signs that would later be interpreted as warning. His confidence had curdled into certainty. His determination had hardened into stubbornness. The man who had knelt on a blood-soaked deck watching Carthage burn was becoming something else. Something that would destroy him far more completely than any enemy fleet. The African shore was beautiful. The men who looked upon it didn't see beauty. They saw the beginning of something that none of them would survive unchanged. The smell of Africa reached them before the coastline resolved from haze into detail. It smelled of earth that had never felt Roman footsteps, of vegetation unfamiliar to men raised on Italian farms, of heat that pressed down like a physical weight, turning armour into ovens and helmets into instruments of torture. The legionaries who had survived Ecnomus stood at the rails of their ships and breathed in a continent that would consume them. Regulus didn't notice the smell. He was already calculating conquest. The landing was unopposed. Carthage's forces had withdrawn inland after receiving news of the naval disaster, leaving the coastal territories to the invaders. Roman ships beached themselves in orderly rows, their keels grinding into African sand while centurions shouted commands that imposed familiar order on an unfamiliar world. Within hours, the army had established a fortified camp. Within days, it was on the march. The initial campaign was everything Regulus had promised. Carthaginian subjects, exhausted by decades of heavy taxation and brutal enforcement, greeted the Romans as liberators. Towns opened their gates rather than face siege. Local leaders offered supplies, intelligence, and auxiliary troops in exchange for protection from their former masters. The army advanced through territory that seemed to surrender out of sheer relief. Regulus sent dispatches to Rome describing victories that required no battles, cities taken without bloodshed, wealth captured without effort, an empire collapsing from within as its subjects chose new masters. The Senate, receiving these reports, began planning triumphs and debating how to divide the spoils of a war that seemed already won. Historians still debate whether Regulus believed his own propaganda. The sources suggest he did, that the ease of the initial advance convinced him Carthage was finished, that one more push would bring the enemy to terms, that the gods themselves had chosen Rome to rule the Mediterranean. This belief would kill him. The problem with his analysis was geographical. Africa was not Italy. It was not Sicily. It was a continent whose scale Roman commanders had never confronted, whose climate turned campaigns into endurance tests, whose peoples had been conquered and reconquered for centuries without ever truly submitting to foreign rule. Carthage understood this. Regulus did not. The Carthaginian response to the invasion was not panic but calculation. They abandoned indefensible coastal territories, trading space for time. They sent envoys to Rome offering peace terms that the Senate would surely accept, terms that would have ended the war on Roman terms and brought Regulus home as a hero. But Regulus rejected the envoys. His demands were so extreme: complete disarmament, massive indemnities, surrender of the Carthaginian navy, that the Carthaginian council had no choice but to refuse. He wanted not just victory but humiliation. He wanted Carthage to grovel. It was the decision of a man intoxicated by success, a man who had forgotten that the sea between him and home was still hostile, a man who had convinced himself that because Rome had won at Ecnomus, Rome could win anywhere. The Senate, basking in reports of African triumphs, made decisions that compounded the disaster. They recalled Vulso and a significant portion of the fleet, believing the naval war was finished. They reduced the army's strength, sending units back to Italy that could serve in other theatres. They left Regulus with 15,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, and orders to finish a war that was far from over. The African winter arrived like a judgment. Rains turned the dusty plains into swamps that swallowed supply wagons. Disease swept through camps designed for Italian summers, not African wet seasons. The local allies who had greeted Romans as liberators began reconsidering their loyalties as Carthaginian agents spread gold and promises through the countryside. And Carthage was not defeated. Carthage was not even close to defeated. The city's wealth, accumulated over centuries of Mediterranean trade, was being converted into a new army. Mercenaries from across the ancient world, Numidian cavalry, Balearic slingers, Greek infantry, Libyan spearmen, were streaming toward Carthage in exchange for pay that Rome could not match. The empire that Regulus had dismissed as broken was rebuilding itself behind walls he could not breach. Most critically, Carthage had sent for help that would transform the war. A Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus was on his way from Greece. He brought no army, only expertise. The tactical knowledge of a professional soldier trained in the most sophisticated military tradition the ancient world had produced. He would look at the Roman legion, analyse its strengths and weaknesses, and design a battle that would destroy everything Regulus had built. The consul didn't know this yet. He was still writing dispatches describing imminent victory, still rejecting peace offers that would have saved his life, still convinced that the same confidence that had won Ecnomus would carry him to Carthage's gates. The trap was closing. Regulus couldn't see it. He had won a battle at sea. He was about to learn that the sea was the easy part. Xanthippus arrived in Carthage with nothing but his eyes and his reputation. He was not young. Decades of professional soldiering had carved lines into a face that showed neither mercy nor doubt. He spoke little, observed everything, and within a week of his arrival had diagnosed exactly why Carthage was losing to farmers who had learned warfare on Italian hillsides. The Carthaginian generals were afraid of the legion. They had faced it in Sicily, watched its methodical advance consume their positions, learned to dread the synchronized discipline that turned individual soldiers into components of a killing machine. This fear had infected their tactics, making them defensive when they should attack, cautious when they should be bold. Xanthippus saw what they couldn't. The legion was powerful, yes, but it was powerful in specific conditions. On open ground, in set-piece battles, with its flanks secured and its formation unbroken, the Roman infantry was nearly invincible. But it was also rigid. It couldn't adapt quickly to changing circumstances. It was vulnerable to cavalry. It panicked when encircled. And Carthage had cavalry. Carthage had more cavalry than Rome had ever faced in a single engagement. The Spartan took command of the Carthaginian army, with a bluntness that offended local generals and a competence that silenced their objections. He drilled the infantry in phalanx tactics, creating a dense formation of spears that could hold Roman attention while other forces manoeuvred. He positioned the war elephants, 100 of the beasts, each carrying a tower of archers, as a mobile wall that would shatter Roman cohesion before the infantry even engaged. Most importantly, he deployed the Numidian cavalry on the flanks. 4,000 horsemen, the finest light cavalry in the ancient world, positioned to sweep around the Roman formation and attack from every direction simultaneously. Historians still debate whether Regulus understood the transformation that had occurred in the enemy camp. His scouts reported increased Carthaginian activity, new formations, unfamiliar tactics. But the consul had spent months defeating Carthaginian armies. He had won every engagement. He had no framework for understanding that his previous victories were irrelevant, that he had been defeating an enemy in the process of evolving into something far more dangerous. The Battle of Tunis began at dawn on a plain that Xanthippus had chosen personally. The ground was flat, open, perfect for cavalry operations. Roman tactical doctrine said that such terrain favoured infantry, that the legion's discipline would overcome any mounted threat. Roman tactical doctrine had never encountered a commander who knew exactly how to exploit its assumptions. Regulus deployed his forces in the standard Roman formation, infantry in the centre, cavalry on the wings, reserves behind the main line. It was the same arrangement that had won battles across Italy and Sicily. It had never failed him. Xanthippus let the Romans advance. The Carthaginian infantry held position as the legions marched toward them, spears levelled in a phalanx that looked almost Greek. The elephants stood in front of the line, their massive shapes outlined against the African sun. The Numidian cavalry waited on the wings, invisible in the dust raised by 100,000 feet. The Roman cavalry struck first, charging the Carthaginian horsemen on both flanks. They were outnumbered 4-1. Within minutes they were scattered or dead, and 4,000 Numidians were wheeling around the Roman infantry like wolves circling wounded prey. Then the elephants charged. The sound was apocalyptic. 100 war elephants at full charge, their feet shaking the earth, their riders screaming, the animals themselves trumpeting with fury that turned human courage to water. Roman soldiers who had never faced elephants in battle, who had only heard stories of the beasts, watched monsters from nightmare bearing down on them, and felt their discipline crack. The first line broke. Men scattered before the elephants reached them, their terror contagious, spreading through formations that had held against every human enemy. The second line tried to hold, but was crushed beneath feet the size of shields, their bodies pulped into the African dirt. And then the cavalry hit the Roman rear. Numidians poured into the disintegrating formation from every direction, their javelins finding gaps in armour, their horses trampling men too stunned to defend themselves. The legion that had conquered the sea was being methodically dismembered by a Spartan who had never sailed a ship in his life. Regulus fought. The sources agree on this. He stood with his guards until standing was impossible, then knelt in the ruins of his command and watched everything he had built collapse around him. The blood of Roman soldiers soaked into African soil. The screams of dying legionaries carried across miles of empty plain. Of 15,000 Roman infantry, 500 survived. Regulus was among them, captured, not killed, dragged before Carthaginian commanders as proof that Rome was not invincible. The man who had rejected peace terms that would have made him a hero was now a prisoner of an enemy he had sworn to humiliate. Ecnomus meant nothing. Victory at sea meant nothing. The lesson was brutal. You cannot conquer what you do not understand. The cell was small and smelled of mould and human waste. Regulus had been imprisoned for months by the time Roman envoys arrived to discuss his ransom. The man they found bore little resemblance to the consul who had commanded 300 ships at Ecnomus. His hair had grown wild, his skin hung loose on a frame starved down to bone. His eyes, and witnesses remarked on this particularly, showed something worse than defeat. They showed understanding. The Carthaginian proposal was straightforward. Regulus would be released in exchange for Carthaginian prisoners held in Rome, plus a commitment to peace negotiations. He would travel to Rome personally to advocate for the exchange. If he failed to persuade the Senate, he would return to captivity. It was a generous offer, more generous than he deserved. Historians still debate whether what happened next was heroism or stubbornness, patriotism or pride. The sources are unreliable. Roman historians had every reason to embellish a story that served their narrative of national virtue. But the outline is consistent across multiple accounts, and the outline is this. Regulus went to Rome, he stood before the Senate, and instead of advocating for his own release, he argued for the continuation of the war. The prisoners Carthage wanted returned, he said, were valuable warriors who would strengthen the enemy. The peace terms being offered would give Carthage time to rebuild its forces. Rome had lost a battle, not a war. Continuing the fight would eventually bring victory. Exchanging him would bring only temporary respite. The Senate listened in silence as a man in chains advocated for his own death. Whether Regulus believed these arguments or simply could not bear the humiliation of returning to Rome as a ransomed prisoner is impossible to know. The practical effect was the same. The Senate rejected the Carthaginian offer. The war continued, and Regulus, honouring his parole, returned to Carthage to die. The stories of his death are probably exaggerated. Later Roman sources describe elaborate tortures, eyelids cut off, forced to stare at the sun until blindness came, then rolled down a hill inside a barrel studded with inward-pointing nails. These details serve propaganda more than history. What is certain is simpler, and perhaps more terrible. He died in captivity, far from home, after having the opportunity for freedom and choosing otherwise. The war he had insisted on continuing lasted another 14 years. Rome eventually won, not through brilliant tactics or heroic leadership, but through the grinding attrition that was the Republic's true weapon. Carthage's resources were exhausted, its mercenaries deserted for better-paying employers, its subject peoples, so briefly hopeful when Regulus arrived as a liberator, returned to Carthaginian control and never trusted foreign promises again. The peace terms that ended the First Punic War were harsher than anything Regulus had demanded. Carthage surrendered Sicily entirely. It paid enormous indemnities. It agreed to restrictions on its fleet that prevented the kind of naval dominance that had once made it master of the Mediterranean. But Carthage survived. The city endured. Its people adapted, as they had adapted to every previous crisis in their long history. Within a generation, they would build a new empire in Spain. Within 2 generations, a general named Hannibal would cross the Alps and bring Rome closer to destruction than Ecnomus ever had. And what of Ecnomus itself? The battle that had broken Carthaginian naval power, the largest naval engagement in ancient history, faded from memory with remarkable speed. Roman historians mentioned it as prologue, a necessary step toward African campaigns that dominated their narratives. The corvus, the brilliant innovation that had transformed naval warfare, was quietly abandoned after storms destroyed fleet after fleet of top-heavy Roman ships. The men who had died there, 10,000 Romans, 40,000 Carthaginians, became statistics in accounts that focused on commanders and campaigns, rather than the anonymous dead. Marcus Atilius Regulus became a legend, but not the legend he would have wanted. He was remembered as an example of Roman virtue, the consul who chose duty over survival, honour over comfort. Schoolchildren for centuries memorised his story as proof that Romans were made of sterner stuff than other peoples. They forgot the blood-soaked deck at dawn. They forgot the smell of burning ships and drowning men. They forgot the screaming that didn't stop until there was no one left to scream. They forgot that victory at sea had led directly to defeat on land. That the confidence Ecnomus built was the same confidence that made Regulus reject peace and march into a trap designed by a Spartan mercenary. That the greatest naval battle in ancient history was merely the first step in a journey that ended in chains. The empire endured, the republic prospered, Sicily became Roman, then Sardinia, then Corsica, then the whole Mediterranean. The man who made it possible died in a foreign prison, remembered for the wrong lessons, his greatest triumph a prologue to his greatest failure. History remembers the victory, it forgot the price.